They said the world you live in is built on laws, order, and truth. But that's a lie. An elegant mask stretched over a rotting structure, and if you listen closely, right now, in the silence between your heartbeats, you can almost hear it. The sound of something buried waking up, not a ghost, not a legend, a fact, a record that was never meant to survive, the kind of truth they chained, burned, and buried. Because if men like you ever learned it, you'd never see power the same way again. Let me take you to a night they erased from the books. August 7th, 1847. Deep in South Carolina, in a plantation engineered like a laboratory for human control. A place where every breath, every calorie, every punishment was measured, cataloged, optimized, and into that machine they inserted her. 7 feet, 2 inches tall, bones denser than oak, a body built like a verdict. They chained her, studied her, experimented on her, thinking she was just another asset. But she wasn't an asset. She was entropy wearing skin, a reminder that no system, no matter how refined, scientific, or brutal, can control the thing it fears most, a mind that has already decided it will not kneel. They thought chains would hold her. They thought fear would silence her. They thought pain would break her. But she accepted all three like a man accepts weather. Unmoved, unaltered, calculating. For 3 days she watched them, memorized them, measured the weight of their arrogance. And when the moment came, she didn't run, she didn't scream, she didn't rebel. She executed. 6 men, armed, seasoned, confident, dead in a room that became a tomb, their bones crushed by the same iron they used to control others. And she walked out, not fast, not frantic, just done, the chains still on her body, now weapons in her hands. That's the moment the story should have been written into every history book. Instead, it was buried, because she proved something lethal. The oppressed are only powerless until they stop believing the rules apply to them. You weren't supposed to know her name. You weren't supposed to know what she did. But you're here now, and once you hear the rest, you won't be the same man you were 8 seconds ago. They called her property, but every record that survived betrays a different truth. She wasn't reacting. She was waiting. That's what the overseers never understood. They mistook silence for submission, stillness for obedience, calculation for emptiness. They thought they were studying her, but she was studying them. Every insult, every blow, every command, she filed it away like a ledger of debt. A debt she would collect in blood. Her name, what little of it remained, was written only as Sarah. No last name, no origin, no tribe, just a first name stripped of lineage, as if she arrived from nowhere. But the witnesses who saw her said she carried herself like someone who remembered exactly who she was. Just not in a language they could understand. Her eyes didn't beg. They measured. They counted exits, weight, breath, timing. Imagine living inside a body designed like a fortress, yet being forced to kneel for men who mistook height for handicap. That was their miscalculation. They thought they owned her strength. They didn't realize her strength owned her will. And the plantation, Riverton Hall, wasn't chaos. It was systematic order, a laboratory for obedience. Every human being inside it was a number, a ratio, a resource. The owner, Marcus Grayson, believed in a future where chains were optimized, where punishment was calculated, where rebellion was not crushed, but mathematically prevented. He believed he had solved the human spirit like a formula. Then came the variable he couldn't solve. On the 4th night, 4 men entered her holding room with tools of domination, whips, clubs, thumb screws. They didn't go in to punish her. They went in to break her, to reprogram her into something predictable. But here's the truth they discovered too late. Some people don't break, they invert the force. She didn't fight them out of desperation. She dismantled them with purpose. She didn't kill to escape. She killed to reset the balance. The plantation wasn't supposed to survive a mind like hers. And after that night, it didn't. Not really. Because what happened next wasn't a riot. It wasn't rebellion. It was reversal, power crossing the floor, one link of iron at a time. And you're not even halfway into how deep this goes. When the door opened and she walked out, she didn't run. That's what the two enslaved men outside never understood until much later. She had no intention of escaping that night. Freedom wasn't the objective. Punishment wasn't the objective. Correction was. She wasn't reacting to violence. She was enforcing a law older than the plantation, older than the country, older than the idea of ownership itself. What you do to another human eventually returns to you multiplied. She walked past the guards as if they were already ghosts. Chains dragging, iron links dripping, her breathing controlled. The moonlit path ahead of her wasn't lit like an exit, more like a corridor. She'd already walked in her mind 1,000 times, and the men who saw her said the same thing in different words. She didn't look free. She looked finished. Some say she was heading toward the slave quarters to free the others. Others believe she was going to burn the entire estate to the ground, but the truth buried in letters, unsigned notes, and half-burned testimonies is darker. She wasn't going to start a rebellion. She was going to force a revelation. She wanted every soul on that land, enslaved or free, to witness something that couldn't be erased, denied, or rewritten. Because the real war wasn't between her and the overseers. It was between fear and awareness, between the belief that the system was unbreakable, and the moment a single person proves it isn't. That's why they had to erase her, not because she killed 6 men. Slave uprisings, escapes, murders, those happened. Records exist. Punishments followed. But this was different. She didn't kill in chaos. She killed in control, in silence. With the tools that were meant to limit her, she turned their restraint into her instrument. That wasn't resistance. That was reversal of hierarchy. You see it now, don't you? This isn't a ghost story. It's a case study in power infection. One moment of unfiltered defiance is more dangerous to an empire than 1,000 protests, because it proves the cage was never locked. It was psychological. And before we go deeper, I want you to prove you're still here. Comment the phrase, THNBMAKSTWAC. Type it twice, not once, twice. That's how we separate the watchers from the awakened. By the time Marcus Grayson was awakened and told what had happened, the house servants swore they saw something change in him. Like the blood drained from a man who suddenly realized his perfect system had grown a heartbeat of its own. He wasn't afraid of the deaths. Overseers were replaceable. He was afraid of the proof that his calculated order wasn't order at all, just a thin layer of numbers hiding a storm he could never control. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He didn't even dress in a hurry. He simply lit a candle, opened the drawer where he kept the private journal no one was supposed to read, and wrote one sentence before he even left the rooms. I have misjudged the depth of human will, not strength, not rage, will, because that's the variable every system builder eventually meets. You can number bodies, measure labor, chart obedience, but will is invisible until it detonates. By 11 p.m., Marcus and 2 armed deputies followed the trail of blood and broken furniture back to the holding room. They didn't go inside. They couldn't. Something about the air inside that room felt wrong. Like violence had weight, like the walls remembered. And Marcus, a man who believed only in data, refused to step into a room where control had died. Instead, he sent the deputies to retrieve her. But retrieval implies someone can be brought back. Sarah wasn't coming back. She had already crossed the invisible threshold between problem and force of nature. When they finally found her, she wasn't running, hiding, or asking for mercy. She was standing in front of the slave quarters, chains in hand, as if waiting for an audience. Not a mob, not a riot, an audience, witnesses, because that was always the point. Not escape, not survival, revelation. She wanted them to see what had been proven. that the men who beat them, starved them, controlled them, could die in the dark like anybody else. Here's the part they never teach. It wasn't the deaths that terrified the slave owners the most. It was the silence of the other enslaved people watching her. No cheering, no screaming. Just realization, like a lock turning in the mind. Because when one person breaks the chain, the rest don't just see freedom, they see the system bleed. What happened in the next 10 minutes should have shattered the entire slave system of the South. But history is not shaped by events, it's shaped by who controls the ink. And the men who watched Sarah standing there, illuminated by torchlight and moonlight, chains hanging from her fists like iron scripture. They understood something no written law ever admitted: control only exists as long as belief sustains it. The deputies aimed their rifles at her. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her arms. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, breathing, not like prey cornered, but like judgment embodied. The enslaved community watched from behind the barred windows of their cabins, and every man, woman, and child understood that if they screamed, if they ran, if they joined her, it would become a war. But Sarah wasn't calling for war. She was calling for witnesses. One of the deputies shouted for her to drop the chain. She didn't move. Another threatened to shoot. Still nothing. Her silence was heavier than command. It wasn't defiance. It was disinterest. Like she had already measured the deputies and found them unworthy of reaction. Marcus arrived seconds later, and the people who were there said it was the first time in their lives they saw a white man look small in front of someone he legally owned. He tried to speak to her, not with rage, but with calculation, like he was negotiating with a hurricane. He used her name. He tried to offer terms. He even lied, pretending she wouldn't be punished if she surrendered. But Sarah didn't come for negotiation. She came to show the lie behind the world. Then something strange happened. Something the official records never mention, but the oral tradition preserves. She didn't attack. She didn't charge. She simply turned her back on Marcus and the deputies, and faced the people in the cabins, the ones who had been taught all their lives that resistance meant death. And she lifted the chain, not as a weapon, but as proof. It was no longer a tool of control. It was a symbol of inversion. The overseers who once dragged it now bled because of it. And at that moment, something happened that no owner, no law, no doctrine of superiority could undo. The enslaved didn't see her as a victim anymore. They saw her as possibility. And possibility is the one thing a system built on domination can never allow to live. That was the night Riverton Hall stopped being a plantation and became a battlefield of belief. Not a battlefield of guns, not of armies, of perception. Because the true architecture of slavery wasn't the whip, or the chains, or the laws written in ink. It was the idea planted in every enslaved mind that resistance was suicide, and obedience was survival. Sarah shattered that idea without a speech, without an army, without even a raised voice. She shattered it by existing outside their script. Marcus realized this before anyone else. That's why he didn't order the deputies to shoot immediately. Not because he had mercy, but because he had fear. Fear of what a body like hers, dying in front of 100 witnesses, would ignite. A martyr is more contagious than a rebel. So he made a calculation: contain the moment, isolate the event, destroy the evidence, rewrite the narrative. That was his instinct. That is always the instinct of power when truth breaks the surface. Silence it, not because it isn't real, but because it's too real to control. But Sarah didn't move. She just stood there, breathing like time was irrelevant. As if the next second, the next command, the next bullet, none of it mattered. And that stillness was more dangerous than any uprising. Because she wasn't trying to lead the enslaved. She was showing them they didn't need to be led. Even the children staring from the windows felt it. The shift. The world didn't feel heavy anymore. Just false. And that's when the deputies noticed something Marcus didn't. The people in the cabins weren't frozen in fear. They were standing, watching, not screaming, not panicking, waiting. And a waiting crowd is more dangerous than a violent one. A violent crowd gives you a reason to crush them. A silent one tells you they've already made a decision in their minds. Marcus had seconds to act before the spell broke and became something unstoppable. So he gave the order. Not to shoot her. To shoot the witnesses. Because systems of domination don't fear the rebel. They fear the awakening, and the moment that order left his mouth, everything burned. The first gunshot wasn't aimed at Sarah. It was fired into the cabin window where a child was standing. The glass shattered. A scream followed, and in that instant, every mask fell away. Marcus didn't care about order. He didn't care about law. He cared about containment. Sarah's defiance was dangerous, but 100 witnesses with a new understanding of fearlessness, that was contagion, and contagion must be quarantined. The deputies opened fire, but not toward the threat standing in the yard, toward the unarmed eyes watching from the shadows. Because that's the true truth of power. It doesn't kill to eliminate danger. It kills to eliminate memory. But the moment the first child fell, the spell that held the enslaved in obedience didn't crack. It collapsed. The cabins exploded with motion. Not rebellion with strategy, but reaction with instinct. Mothers ran for their children. Fathers threw themselves in front of bullets. The ones who had been silent all their lives found themselves screaming, not in fear, but in fury so old it felt like inheritance. And Sarah, she didn't run. She didn't attack. She walked. Walked straight toward the man who ordered the murder of witnesses. Marcus saw her coming and shouted for the deputies to turn their guns on her. But they hesitated. Not from mercy, but because she kept walking through the bullets they were already firing at the crowd. The line between target and massacre blurred, and in that blur, something terrifying surfaced. They had lost control of focus. You cannot control a mob in motion. You cannot intimidate a woman who has already accepted death. You cannot shoot a symbol and expect it to bleed the way a body does. Sarah reached Marcus before a single shot touched her. Not because she was untouchable, but because every man pointing a rifle understood, in some instinctual animal way, that stopping her wouldn't stop what had already begun. When she stood before him, close enough to see the tremor in his fingers, she finally spoke. Not a speech, not a threat, just 4 words, "You don't own breath." And that sentence hit harder than any weapon, because it named the lie. The entire foundation of slavery wasn't chains. It was ownership of life itself, and Sarah returned that life to its rightful place, not inside laws, but inside lungs. The crowd behind her had changed. They weren't victims anymore. They were witnesses turned participants. And the moment a witness becomes a participant, history becomes unstoppable. The night stopped belonging to the men with guns. It no longer mattered who held weapons, who held titles, who held the law. What mattered was that the enslaved had crossed the invisible line. Every system of terror depends on the line between watching and acting. Marcus tried to regain control the only way men like him know how. By shouting orders louder than the truth already unfolding around him. But command means nothing when the commanded no longer recognize your authority. The deputies were trapped in a paradox. They had the power to kill, but no power to control what killing would now create. Every bullet they fired no longer suppressed rebellion. It fed it. Every scream no longer intimidated. It testified. Every body that fell became a reason for 2 more to rise. And in the center of it all, Sarah stood. Not as a leader, not as a savior, but as the unspoken answer to the question every enslaved person had carried in their bones. What happens if we stop believing they are gods? They saw the answer. The men with guns bled like everyone else. The masters trembled like everyone else. The law shattered the moment people stopped obeying it. Sarah didn't need to swing the chain again. Her existence had already swung the world. But revolutions are never pure. Resistance never moves in one clean arc. Chaos is the price of awakening. And Riverton Hall became chaos. Flames spread where torches fell. Animals broke loose from their pens. The night filled with the sound of rage, and prayer woven into one sound. Something that wasn't quite human anymore, but something truer. Some ran for the fields. Some ran toward the fight. Some fell to their knees, not in surrender, but in shock that the world they were born into had finally split open. And Sarah. She didn't raise her arms like a leader. She didn't shout for uprising. She didn't give commands. She walked, away from Marcus, away from the body he tried to own, into the fire, lit darkness, where the enslaved began choosing for the first time in their lives. Not between obedience or punishment, but between fear and freedom. Some followed her. Some stayed behind. Some weren't ready. But the lie was dead. And once a lie dies, no amount of bullets can resurrect it. By dawn, Riverton Hall was no longer a plantation. It was a wound, an echo, a place history would later pretend was an unfortunate incident, instead of what it truly was, the moment the enslaved stopped being property and started being possibility. Marcus survived the night, but something far more important than his body was destroyed, the mythology of control. Even as he lay bleeding, clutching the reality that his power had never been divine, only obeyed, he still believed he could fix it. Men like him always do. They think the world is made of paper and signatures, and as long as they can rewrite the narrative, they can erase the truth. And so, before the sun fully rose, he sent riders to the nearest town. Not for help, but for history. Because what happens during the night doesn't matter, if the morning belongs to the side with the printing press. The official version would say, a violent slave uprising occurred. Property was destroyed. Lives were lost. The reports would leave out who fired first. They would turn murdered children into casualties of unrest. They would erase Sarah entirely, or reduce her to a criminal, a madwoman, an unnamed agitator. That's how power survives revolutions it fails to prevent. Not by killing the body, by killing the story. But what Marcus didn't understand, what no owner ever fully grasps, is that by the time ink is poured, memory is already moving. Those who ran into the woods carried the truth with them. Those who hid in the fields whispered her name like a prayer. Those who buried their dead buried the lie with them. And then there were the ones who followed Sarah. They didn't run from the plantation, they ran toward the unknown. With no map, no leader, no guarantee of survival. Only the knowledge that staying was no longer living. Some would be hunted. Some would be caught. Some would disappear into the swamps and become stories parents told in low voices, not to scare their children, but to arm them. And Sarah, her fate is not in the records, because she walked out of the part of history that white men could edit. She crossed the border between documented and unforgettable. The state would claim there was no survivor who led the revolt. The enslaved would remember a woman who made chains obey her. And both versions would exist. One written, one true. In the months that followed, Riverton Hall became both a cautionary tale and a quiet prophecy, depending on who was telling it. To the slaveholding world, it was a reminder of what happens when leniency is mistaken for weakness. To the enslaved across the county lines, it was something far more dangerous, proof that the system could bleed. Word didn't travel by newspaper. It traveled by breath, by hands passing food in the fields, by songs with new verses added, by sermons where the preacher said, Moses. But everyone heard, Sarah. The name could not be written without risk, but once a truth becomes rumor, it's already immortal. And the rumor was this: she broke the chain. She killed the overseer. She walked through bullets. She spoke to the master like he was dust. No one told it the same way, but every telling carried the same message. They are not gods. They are not endless. They are not inevitable. Plantation owners heard the rumor too. And fear, real fear, not the theatrical kind, spread through them like infection. They held emergency meetings. They inspected shacks for hidden tools. They increased patrols. They paid for new laws to be written faster than old blood could dry. But here is the quiet truth. Every empire learns only at the end of once belief in control wears thin. Force becomes expensive. They could no longer walk the fields without pistols. They could no longer sleep without guards. They could no longer trust silence, because silence might now mean planning. Meanwhile, the enslaved stopped walking with their eyes lowered. Not all at once. Not every day. But sometimes. Just enough to shift the air. Enough for a master to feel stared through instead of up at. Enough for a whip to feel light in a hand that suddenly wondered whether the wrist holding it might someday be broken. Revolutions don't always roar. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they look back. And somewhere in the swamps or the mountains or the memory of every child who saw her stand in the torchlight, Sarah lived on. Not as a person, as a permission. The system remained, but the obedience that sustained it cracked. Hairline at first, then spreading, then impossible to seal, because once one woman proves chains are just metal, every locked hand starts feeling for a key. History likes to pretend that change arrives in a single moment. A battle, a speech, a law. But what happened after Riverton didn't look like change. It looked like inconvenience. Tools went missing. Work slowed. Eyes held a second too long. Fires started in places where fires shouldn't be. Overseers drank more. Patrols doubled. Trust thinned. The world didn't flip overnight. It tilted. And the ones who felt it first were not the enslaved. They had felt the world's imbalance their whole lives. It was the owners, the lawmakers, the men who built their sense of self around the belief that they were the axle of society. When that axle trembled, the whole myth of order trembled with it. They wrote new slave codes, not to stop rebellion, but to stop imagination. They outlawed literacy, gatherings, drums, night travel, independent worship, even laughter in groups, because laughter meant communication, and communication meant planning, and planning meant Riverton could happen again. And if it could happen again, it could happen bigger. But laws written in fear always have a smell. The enslaved could smell it. Meanwhile, the story of Sarah spread the way forbidden things always do, by being whispered where no ear of power can reach. Not like a legend of victory, but like a diagnosis. Something in the bones of the South is breaking. Some enslaved men taught themselves how to sharpen plow, metal into blades at night. Some women learned the patrol schedules by pretending to fetch water. Children played games that were not games at all, practicing silence, signals, escape routes. The learning was not organized, but it was shared. No one said they were planning rebellion. They were planning options, and that is what terrified the system more than fire, more than blood, more than revolt. The enslaved stopped believing their only future was the one written for them. Somewhere, someone always asked, "What if we left?" And somewhere else, someone finally answered, "What if we stayed and they left?" That was the real legacy of Riverton. Not the violence, not the bodies, not the fire. The question. Once a question like that enters a people, it cannot be removed. It waits. It grows. It chooses its moment. Sarah didn't teach them how to fight. She taught them how to imagine being free without asking permission. And once imagination gets looser, history starts counting down. By the time a year had passed, Riverton was no longer spoken of in public. But it was present in every field where a whip cracked, in every church where the sermon lingered too long on Exodus, in every patrol checkpoint where a white man looked twice at a path that had always been empty before. It lived like a bruise under the skin of the South, unseen by the ones who caused it, unforgettable to the ones who carried it. The newspapers called it an isolated disturbance. The slave patrol called it a warning. The enslaved had another word for it beginning. They didn't expect another Sarah to appear. They didn't need one. The point of a spark is not to be repeated. It is to make the world permanently aware that fire is possible. And everywhere, the question she left behind began shaping decisions in quiet, but irreversible ways. Someone who once tolerated a beating now raised their eyes. Someone who once ran alone now waited for others. Someone who once accepted God's will now asked, "Who's God?" But the most dangerous shift was this. The enslaved stopped believing that freedom had to be given. They started believing it could be taken. And white society felt that belief like temperature. Churches began preaching obedience more aggressively. Politicians demanded harsher laws. Patrols trained as if they were preparing for war. Because deep down, even the defenders of slavery knew the truth. No system survives once the people inside it stop, agreeing to play their assigned role. That's why Riverton was erased from official history, not because it was insignificant, but because it was too clear an example of how fragile the entire institution was. If a woman with no army, no weapon, no legal name could destabilize a plantation, then what could 1,000? What could 10,000? So they buried her story, but stories don't stay buried when they're carried in the body. A woman in Louisiana told it as a warning to her sons. A preacher in Georgia told it as prophecy to his congregation. A runaway in Tennessee carved her initials into a tree, SR, and never explained why. The owners believed they erased her, but every time a slave looked at a chain and didn't immediately bow to it, Sarah was there. Not a ghost. A reference point, a reminder that obedience is not nature, it is training, and training can be undone. There is a moment in every collapsing system where the people who built it can feel the end coming, even if they refuse to say it out loud. For the South, that moment wasn't a battle, a speech, or a law. It was the quiet suspicion that the enslaved were no longer afraid in the same way. Not fearless, but changed. The difference is everything. Fear used to mean paralysis. Now it meant calculation. Silence used to mean submission. Now it meant strategy. Obedience used to be automatic. Now it was performed. And the people in power didn't know what to do with a world where the enslaved could look at them without looking through them. Some plantation owners pretended Riverton never happened. Others obsessed over it, counting their guns, reinforcing the slave quarters, inspecting every face for signs of defiance. But no matter what they did, they couldn't erase the one thing they couldn't control. Memory grows even when it's outlawed. By then, the story of Sarah had split into branches. In one version, she vanished like a spirit. In another, she led dozens into the swamps and lived free. In another, she returned years later to burn Riverton to the ground herself. None of those versions were confirmed. All of them were believed, because the accuracy of the story didn't matter. Its use did. When a man thought about running, he thought of Sarah. When a woman fought back against a beating, she remembered the chain in her hands. When a child asked if white men could be killed, someone whispered, "One already was." And yet, the greatest danger wasn't the ones who planned rebellion, it was the ones who stopped planning to die obedient. Hope is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is not cinematic, it is a slow corrosion of the rules other people expect you to live by. And the South felt that corrosion spreading. Plantation ledgers showed more accidents, more escapes, more illness that mysteriously struck only the overseers. Tools broke in ways that couldn't be explained. Horses refused their riders. Fires started for no reason, no organized revolt. Just pressure, uncoordinated, unannounced, unstoppable. Sarah hadn't given them instructions. She'd given them permission to improvise. And once a people stop waiting for a leader, they stop being controlled by the fear of having none. The most powerful lie ever told about slavery is that it ended because outsiders gave freedom. But what happened after Riverton, quiet, unrecorded, unpredictable, was the real beginning of the end. Not abolitionist speeches, not political debates, not moral awakenings in northern parlors. It was the slow, relentless internal collapse of a system whose victims stopped cooperating with their own subjugation. Slavery didn't fall because the enslaved were freed. It began to fall because they stopped behaving like slaves. That shift happened in the smallest acts, the ones no law could legislate and no overseer could fully see. A man who pretended not to understand an order. A woman who shared poison recipes in the laundry yard. A child who memorized patrol routes and repeated them like songs. A field hand who broke the cotton gin with one well-placed stone. Every act was tiny. Every act multiplied. And every act was rooted in the same realization Sarah had proven with her own existence. There is no such thing as lawful ownership of a human being. Once that truth is internalized, the rest is logistics. Some enslaved people planned revolts. Others planned survival. Others planned escape. Others simply planned to outlive the system, so they could watch it crumble under the weight of its own panic. Every choice was rebellion because every choice was self-direction, and that is the one thing slavery cannot tolerate. Meanwhile, white society entered the stage of decline where obsession disguises itself as order. They added iron bars to windows, tripled the patrol, chained the tools at night, passed laws against teaching slaves inflammatory ideas, like basic geography. They were no longer trying to maintain control. They were trying to recreate belief. But belief doesn't come back once exposed. The enslaved saw their owners differently now, not as gods or inevitabilities, but as men who could die. Men who could be afraid, men who could be lied to, missiled, disobeyed, resisted, or simply ignored. And once the enslaved understood the fragility of the master, something irreversible happened. They stopped measuring themselves by his standards. Power didn't shift in a parade. It eroded like rope, thread by thread. Until finally, one day, the system that claimed it would last forever collapsed. Not because it was overthrown from the outside, but because it was abandoned from within. Sarah was never credited, but every fracture carried her fingerprints. But here's the truth: most people never hear. Systems of domination never die cleanly. They don't shatter, they mutate. The men who survived Riverton didn't write reports admitting fear. They wrote policy. They turned panic into legislation. They turned humiliation into doctrine. They turned one woman's unrecorded uprising into a blueprint for tighter control. Not just of bodies, but of minds. That is the part history erases. Because the real danger wasn't Sarah's strength. It was the idea she left behind. That a single human, even chained, beaten, and isolated, could still reach a level of inner authority that no institution could break. The plantation system could restrain muscle, but it could not restrain will. Once a slave stops believing they are property, the master's world begins to dissolve. So the reaction came fast. Within 5 years, Southern states passed new chain laws, not just for restraints but for thought. Illegal to gather after dark. Illegal to teach reading. Illegal to speak certain African dialects. Illegal to hold tools without supervision. Illegal to look at a white person with defiant expression. They even passed laws criminalizing unnatural physical strength, a category invented because no one could explain how Sarah survived so long without breaking, until she chose to. But the more laws they wrote, the more proof they created. The enslaved were not the ones who were afraid. The masters were. And you need to understand something deeper. Nothing in the psychology of power frightens an oppressor more than the moment the oppressed realizes obedience is optional. That was the real chain Sarah shattered. Not the iron. The spell. You can kill a rebel. You cannot kill a revelation. That's why the story was buried. Why the autopsy was removed. Why witnesses vanished. Why descendants refused to speak. Because Sarah wasn't just a slave who fought back. She was a mirror showing every master what they truly were without the forced obedience of others. Small men with borrowed power, And that is the kind of truth that can collapse an empire from the inside out. You want to keep going deeper, because the next section reaches the midpoint, and that's where you stop being a spectator and start becoming part of the transformation. This is where the descent stops being historical and starts becoming personal, because every story like Sarah's isn't just about the past. It's a coded message for the present, a warning, a map, a test to see who is still asleep and who is ready to recognize the chains that didn't disappear, only changed shape. You think slavery ended. No, it evolved. It moved from iron to ideology, from whips to wages, from plantations to institutions, from overseers to algorithms. The same psychology that tried to break Sarah now breaks modern men, not with chains, but with narratives. Stay obedient. Stay entertained. Stay manageable. Stay predictable. The plantation is now invisible, and the whip is internal. They don't need to beat you if they can convince you to beat yourself. But every system has a crack. The moment one person refuses the script and exposes the illusion. Sarah didn't escape her chains. She redefined them. She turned the instrument of her restraint into the instrument of her attack. That is the core principle of every real rebellion, Zen. You don't destroy the weapon, you reclaim it. Now listen closely, because this is the turning point. If you've been watching just to be entertained, this is where you stop. If you're watching because you feel something, some buried instinct waking up, then this is where you choose, because identities don't change from information, they change from declaration. So here's the test. If you're ready to stop being an observer and start stepping into the mindset of the unchained, comment this phrase twice below. The chains become the weapon. Not once, twice. Why twice? Because repetition seals identity, because the algorithm notices, because ritual matters, because men who repeat truth reshape themselves through it. Type it once, and it's just a sentence. Type it twice, and it becomes a signal to me, a signal to others watching, a signal to yourself. This is not a fan base. This is a transformation in progress. If you can feel the shift, you already know we're not done. The next section isn't just darker. It reveals why Sarah was never meant to survive, and why her existence threatened more than one plantation. Now that you've spoken the phrase and crossed the threshold, you're ready for what most people are never allowed to hear. Sarah wasn't just a physical anomaly. She was a contamination risk, not because of her size, but because of what she represented to everyone forced to live beneath the same system. Proof that the limits placed on them were artificial. That is why she had to be erased. Not punished, not contained. Erased. And the erasure wasn't just about the 4 men she killed. It was about the collapse of something far more fragile than bone: belief in the master's invincibility. One moment of defiance from a single enslaved woman did what decades of rebellion couldn't. Made the oppressor look breakable. So the silence that followed wasn't a cover-up. It was a quarantine. Doctors, magistrates, clergy, even early proto-psychologists. Everyone who handled the aftermath treated Sarah like a pathogen of will. They didn't fear her strength. They feared the idea of her being understood, repeated, imitated. They feared she might become a story told in cabins by candlelight, or a whisper that spread through work gangs, or a myth carried to other plantations like a spark carried on wind. Because all slave systems are built on the same dependency. The enslaved must believe escape is impossible. The moment they see one person break the frame cracks for everyone. And Riverton wasn't the only place watching. Letters from Charleston merchants, naval officers, and plantation elites show something strange. Within months of the incident, orders for reinforced restraints tripled across the region, not just for the physically strong, but for anyone considered mentally unyielding. A new category entered the ledgers: spiritually dangerous. Understand what that means. They weren't restraining bodies anymore. They were trying to restrain mindset. Meanwhile, among the enslaved, Sarah's silence took on meaning. Some believed she was possessed by ancestral spirits. Some believed she had trained herself to feel no pain. Others believed she was chosen by forces older than slavery itself. Forces that do not negotiate with owners, governments, or nations. Whether any of that was literal didn't matter. Myth is more dangerous than fact, because myth doesn't need permission to spread, and the men in charge understood that the most lethal weapon in any oppressed population is not rage, not muscle, not numbers, but a story they're willing to believe in more than they fear the master. That is why Sarah disappeared from history, because legends cannot be chained. But the story doesn't end with Riverton Hall, because after the bodies were buried, after the records were altered, after the official inquiry sealed its conclusions in language so vague, it might as well have been smoke. Something else began to move beneath the surface of the South, something the authorities couldn't document, but felt like a rising temperature inside walls they thought were solid. Rumors, not the kind you hear in courtrooms or written in ledgers. The kind carried in the spaces between spoken words. The kind whispered in work lines, traded in coded songs embedded in braiding patterns, carved into wood, marked in dust, sewn into hems. A story of a woman who refused to bow, a woman who could not be broken, a woman who took her chains and turned them into judgment. And that story traveled, by riverboat crews, by hired-out slaves moving from estate to estate, by free black sailors who heard fragments in ports, and retold them in taverns from New Orleans to Philadelphia, even by white abolitionists who didn't fully understand what they were hearing, but sensed the power of a tale that escaped the control of both master and state. Within 3 years, the story had mutated. She wasn't 7 feet tall anymore, she was 8. She didn't just kill 4 overseers, she killed 12. She didn't escape with chains, she dissolved them with her bare hands. But none of that was error. That was evolution, because the enslaved weren't preserving historical accuracy. They were preserving permission. Permission to resist. Permission to imagine revolt. Permission to see themselves not as prisoners, but as contenders. And that is the one thing every empire fears more than rebellion: alternative identity. When a man stops seeing himself as a subject, the system loses 50% of its power instantly, and the remaining 50% becomes a countdown. That is why the South doubled down on psychological warfare. That is why sermons preached obedience as gospel. That is why doctors labeled defiant slaves diseased. That is why slave catchers were paid more for returning runaways who ninjured, because torture was no longer just punishment. It was public theater, designed to replace the Sarah story with fear. They were not fighting bodies anymore. They were fighting belief systems. And the truth they feared most was already loose. You cannot enslave someone who no longer accepts your definition of them. By the time the authorities realized what was happening, it was already too late. The story of Sarah had done something they had no vocabulary for. It had decentralized. It no longer belonged to Riverton, or to one plantation, or even to one woman. It had become a shared weapon, a psychological underground, spreading through people who had no meetings, no leaders, no printed pamphlets, no formal conspiracy. And yet, the South felt the conspiracy. Runaway attempts increased in counties that had never seen them before. Slave patrols began reporting unusual confidence among captives. Overseers complained that punishment no longer had the same effect. And in plantation journals, those private diaries that were never meant for public eyes, there is a repeated phrase, written almost verbatim by different men in different states: "They look at us differently now." Not with fear, not with obedience, but with calculation. That was the fracture. Because a slave who fears you is predictable. A slave who measures you is already planning. So the system responded the only way it knew how, with escalation. New laws criminalized even speaking about rebellion. Possession of seditious stories became a punishable offense. Some plantations banned singing entirely because too many songs contained coded names and messages. And still, the story spread because they were fighting the wrong enemy. They thought they were suppressing information. They were actually trying to suppress transformation. You cannot outlaw a shift in self-perception. You cannot police a thought someone has already accepted as truth. You cannot rewrite a legend living in the bloodstream of thousands. Meanwhile, abolitionists in the North began hearing fragments of the myth and misunderstood it entirely. They tried to turn Sarah into a martyr, a symbol of tragic violence. But in the South, she was not a martyr. She was a prototype. She did not die for a cause. She proved the cause was achievable. And the story continued to evolve again. Not larger, not bloodier, but strategic. In some versions, Sarah escaped and was never caught. In others, she returned secretly at night to free others. In still others, she was not one woman at all, but a name shared by many, a title passed to any enslaved person who fought back and survived. A role, not a person. They tried to erase her from history. Instead, they created something history couldn't hold,